Okay, hi everyone. I'm Noah. I work in the UX and UI teams here at Wolfram, and I'm talking about the notebook toolbar and how we implemented it. So it's actually implemented entirely in top-level Wolfram language code. So this is how we did it. So I'll give a brief overview of the toolbar, and then sort of up front, we knew that there were going to be kind of two main implementation challenges. Trying to implement it in Wolfram language. And so I'll review, what features we have available, what boxes, what might help us, and then how we can use those to solve those challenges. Okay, so yeah, just a quick overview of the toolbar. As I said at the top, the UX of the toolbar, in other words, what we put in there and why, that was covered in a different talk. So if you're interested in that, sort of look that up on the schedule. Yeah, so here is the toolbar here, and so if I narrow this window, then you can see that the controls, they're kind of being elided away, and then if I click here, they're in this little pop-up, and so these really were the two challenges. First of all, just how do you create this overflow system? How do we implement that? And secondly, how do you align these pop-ups with the buttons in the docked cell, because they're two different content areas, so it's actually not trivial. And then one other thing I'll point out quickly that will be relevant for later is that you can see, so if I'm in like a text, an input cell or evaluatable cell, we have some controls here. And then if I'm in a text cell, they change to like text formatting controls. So anyway, that will be relevant later. Okay, so the first issue is overflow. So let's first sort of define what we want. So discrete elision of a row of items. And so, for example, I've got some messier objects here. And so as I resize this container, they're disappearing sort of one by one, right? And that's what we want. And then we also need to know which items have been elided so that we can put them into the overflow menu, right? So if I click on this, then we've got the items that were to the right of that. And the issue is that there's no pre-existing overflow box that does this. So we need to implement this ourselves. So, okay, what tools do we have available? So we have things like panes and pane selectors, and you can use a pane to sort of constrict content and wrap content, an expression. And then pane selector allows you to kind of dynamically show one of several panes based on some state variable. We then also have the initialization option to dynamic module. And so when that box is first rendered on screen, that code will fire. And then sort of related, there's dynamic wrapper, which is, when that box is on screen, it's updating the thing sort of constantly behind it. We then also have current value, absolute current value, and mouse position. And basically, these are ways of querying various states of the front end. And these are very powerful, as John mentioned the other day. And then finally, we have attached cells, and this is going to turn out to be quite important. So I'll just go into a little bit of detail here. And so the idea is that you can take a cell and you can attach it to a parent, and the parent might be another cell, or a box within a cell, or indeed just the notebook. And then we have arguments for controlling like the alignment, the positioning of the two of the attached cell with relation to its parent. And so, for example, here, I'm attaching this cell to the evaluation cell on the left. And so you can see there, it's just attached over the evaluation cell and return the cell objects conveniently. And then here I'm attaching it instead to the right of the actual notebook. And so you can see here that it's not actually, it's not attached to any cell. It really is pinned to the right of the notebook. Okay, so bearing in mind those, sure. So they can't be attached to docked cells. They can be attached to boxes within docked cells, but that was new in 13.1. 13.1. Yeah. So they can be attached to boxes inside docked cells, but that was new in 13.1. And you've touched on the alignment issue, which is that, well, you can't attach it to the docked cell. So you have to attach it to the notebook. Where do you put it? So that, yeah. So going back to overflow, the what you might think to do is, okay, well, if you knew the widths of all the individual items, then you and then you were tracking the window width, well, you could work out by adding them up sort of, which one should be hidden at a certain time. And you could do that with a pane selector and just dynamically switch them with like, 0 width spaces or something. And so if you're interested, the details and implementation are in this section. So download the presentation and check that out. And basically what you find is that because there are lots of dynamics in this, as in explicit dynamics that we wrote in this solution, those create inefficiencies, right? And so, for example, there's, first of all, there's the dynamic wrapper, which is going to fire every time the window is resized. And then there's a dynamic in each item to know when to switch it. And so the moral of this story is, can we do this without using dynamic? We minimize the numbers of dynamics we have to use. And so, as I've said here, we want to exploit boxes that don't rely on dynamics to achieve their effects. So, okay, in terms of elision, forgetting the actual sort of overflow menu at the moment, but just in terms of elision, line breaking would work perfectly for that. So we can use pane and then the various options to make sure that we're only seeing the right bit to just view the first line of items. So in other words, they will line break away from the end. And if we can just view the first row, then we've kind of solved that problem. And we can do that by just setting the right sort of image size of the pane and the alignment and scroll position. And so this is what I'm doing here. So I've got a pane around this row of items. These are the options I just talked about. So the line breaking, scroll positions, etc. And oh, sorry. So I should have mentioned that the front end tries to do line breaking in a good way for sort of code and math. And so line breaking adjustments has to be used to kind of get the desired line breaking. In other words, one thing off the end at a time. And so if I evaluate this then and put it in this resizable container, then we have these items and I've highlighted the pane so you can actually see what it's doing. So at the moment, I haven't constricted it to the first line. And so you can see that they're line breaking away one by one. And then if I do constrict this to the first line, then you can see that they're disappearing one by one and you don't see anything else. Okay, so that's good, but yeah. So the scroll position. So if you think about it, there are two lines and you can only see one of them. So if you put the mouse over and then you scrolled, exactly, yes, you're freezing the scroll position, yeah. So this doesn't solve the overflow problem though. And so, okay, how do we think about this? Well, instead of a row of items, let's start with a row of overflow buttons, right? So let's say I've got 5 items. So I'm going to start with 5 overflow buttons. Okay, then I'm going to cover the overflow buttons with a row of items. And you don't need the last item to begin with, but I'll come to that later. So, okay, so this is the row of items. These are the row of overflow buttons. I'm going to cover the overflow buttons with the items. And now I'm connecting the nth item to the n+1th overflow button. So what does that mean? So in other words, overflow button 5, I'm connecting item 4 to it, right? And then item 3 is connected to overflow button 3, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you think about this, what happens is when I resize this, overflow 5 is going to break away, but because 4 is attached to it, it's going to take it with it and reveal the next overflow button, okay? And so if you look at the top row, it's almost sort of what we want. And then, of course, the final thing is, well, you don't need an overflow button on the end of the row, right? Because there's nothing to the right of it to put in the overflow button. So you just replace the last overflow button, in other words, the 5th one here, with the last item. And so then this is the structure that we have. And I'll explode this vertically so we can see what's going on. And so if I kind of just half hide this and then go through that again. So I'm going to drag this in. 5 is going to line break away and take 4 with it. And then that's going to reveal the first overflow button. And then, so on and so forth. And so if I completely put that back, that's the behavior that we wanted, right? Okay, so how do we actually construct this? Well, we can do it with attached cell because we want things that are sort of hovering over other things and attached to other things, right? And so the The items are the things that need to cover the overflow buttons, which means that the overflow buttons are the parents and the items are attached to them. And so we can use this by using the initialization on the dynamic module, right? So this is an overflow button, and the initialization that we want is to attach the item that's to the left of it, right, to it, and so that's what these alignment options are doing. Okay, so download the presentation, look at the implementation details, which I don't have time to cover now. But essentially, if you run, this section, this code, then I'm defining a function called construct, and that's building our sort of our construct, our little toolbar thing. And then again, I've put it in this resizable container. Okay, so let's see what happens. So I'm going to resize this, and yes, they're breaking away, and we have the overflow menu as expected. But the problem is that attached cells hover over everything. And so although the parents have indeed been hidden, the attached cells are still there, and so they're still visible. And so this almost works, and it contains no dynamic updating. After the initializations fire, there's no kind of dynamic tracking of anything. But we can still see those attached cells even when their parents are hidden. So we could increase the line spacing as a hack, because if you think about it, right, this is line breaking onto a new line, right? So if you just increase this to some enormous number so it was always off the bottom of the notebook, that would work, but it's a bit of a hack. And that's actually what I've parameterized out here. So this argument is the line spacing between these lines. And so, for example, okay, if I put in 100, then this appears to work, right? Because all those attached cells are way off the bottom of the screen somewhere. But that is a hack. However, if the containing interface is known not to exceed a certain height, so for example, you might be in a palette that is always going to be a certain height or never bigger than a certain height, then this is a perfectly reasonable solution. And of course, the toolbar is only one line tool, so the line spacing solution works just fine. As I kind of alluded to at the beginning, the docked cell area really is a separate content area. So it will sort of clip attached cells. They won't bleed into the notebook content area. So this is fine. Okay, so what am I doing here? So I'm making a notebook, and then I'm adding a docked cell, and in that docked cell is the construct we just made. And then all I'm going to do is just dynamically control the height of the cell so we can kind of see what's going on. So if I run this, I didn't run the code section. Oops. Right, let's try that again, shall we? Great, okay. So if I resize the window, then great, this is working, this is working as expected. And then if I increase the size of this cell, now we can see those attached cells that were hidden. So comparing this to the notebook toolbar, and I apologize, it's a bit small, but this is how the notebook toolbar is working. So, I'll elide some items here, and then if I do what I did previously, if I change essentially the height of the toolbar cell, we can see that actually all those controls are just hiding there. And remember also that all of the items, they're just attached cells. So it's surprisingly easy to break the notebook toolbar if you just enumerate all the cells in a notebook that are attached and then delete them. You can see that all those controls are actually just attached cells, and you can see the overflow buttons behind them. Okay, so because we've got this solution that doesn't contain any explicit dynamics, we've kind of freed ourselves up to use dynamics elsewhere. So we can do some heavier lifting elsewhere. And so what you might want to do, as I showed at the beginning, was dynamically hide and show some items based on a certain context. So for example, whether the insertion point is in a text cell or in an input cell. And so the way you do this, you take your toolbar here, and then you put it in this dynamic wrapper that's going to update, that's going to track some state variable. And then you can just use pane selectors to swap out an item for a zero width spacer, right? So here's, depending if this state is like X, then you'll see the item. If it's Y, then the item is hidden by a zero width spacer, and then similarly with the overflow buttons. So you have to just be a little careful when you're doing this. So suppose we want to hide item 3. Now, what you might think is that, okay, I want to hide item 3, and therefore I also need to hide the overflow button underneath it. So in other words, overflow 3. So if I hide both of those, if I collapse them to 0 width panes, okay, and then see what happens, it doesn't quite work. So 5 breaks away, takes 4 with it. 4 breaks away, and if I just kind of put this back here, we're left with just an end because we're left with that 0 width overflow button on the end. So what you have to do is you have to ensure that you always have these pairs overlapping. You have to maintain this structure. And so if I want to hide item 3, I have to hide the thing it's attached to. So I have to hide overflow 4 as well, in other words, the thing to the right of it. And so if I do that, so this is going to go to a 0 width and this is going to go to 0 width. Now, if we see what happens, everything works. So 5 breaks away, takes 4. Yes, these are on the end, but they're 0 width. You can't see them. And so we're just left, whoops. And so we're just left with, with the next overflow button, which peels off as before. Okay, so that's that issue solved. So second is pop-up alignment. And so the reason why this is a pain, as we were talking about, is that the docked cell area and the notebook body area are completely separate content areas. And so, for example, that has an effect that has consequences for attached cells. So if I attach this cell here to the docked cell of this notebook, right, you can see that it is completely confined to that docked cell, and it doesn't sort of bleed over into the notebook content area. And if I do the same thing to the notebook content area, so if I attach this blue cell, to this area here, then we see the same behavior. So therefore, you must attach pop-ups to the notebook body. Now, of course, this is only relevant if you want sort of rich pop-ups that you want to put in an attached cell. If you just want action menus as we were using before, then obviously that's fine. So what this means is that, yeah, these attached cell pop-ups, they must be attached to the notebook body so that they're visible. But then you've kind of lost your alignment point, right? So, this pop-up gets attached to your evaluation notebook, but then how do you align it with the button that it's meant to be sort of spawning from? Okay, so again, there's sort of a more straightforward but perhaps but suboptimal solution, which is, well, again, if you knew all the item widths, you could just pre-calculate everything, right? So you could pre-calculate all the horizontal positions of each control. But this actually has sort of several disadvantages. One is that it might not quite be the same on each operating system. You also have to know the overall offset of the entire construct because you need to add that to all those spacings. So it's not great. So what can we do? We can use mouse position differences. So if the okay, so let's say this is this is a control here in the docked cell. If we know the mouse position when the mouse is clicked relative to the notebook, which is this blue line, and if we know the mouse position relative to the item, which is this red line, then of course if we subtract the red line from the blue line, we get the left edge of this of this button, and so we've now got an offset that we can attach that we can place that pop-up. Okay, so how do we get these mouse positions? Well, you can just, there's this mouse position event handler absolute, and so you can just wrap your control in sort of an event handler that doesn't really do anything. And so that's what I've done here. And so you can see that, when the mouse is outside of the event handler, it's just none. And then inside, it's giving the mouse position relative to the event handler. And then to get the mouse position relative to the window, it's view absolute. Okay, so you can then kind of generalize this to 2 dimensions because, of course, mouse position is returning a 2-dimensional coordinate. And so if you subtract, again, just subtract the event handler absolute from view absolute, then you can get the bottom left-hand corner. And so that's what's happening here. So the top arrow is view absolute, the bottom arrow is event handler absolute, And the difference of them gives the blue arrow, which is pointing to the bottom left corner of the event handler. And of course, this works wherever this is on screen, right? So you can just kind of locate this wherever it is. And then finally, you can also get the size, because of course you may want to attach to the right edge rather than the left edge. And so if you just take the quotient of the absolute coordinates over the scaled coordinates, that's going to give you the size of this event handler, which then you could add to this coordinate here. Yes, if you want to implement this yourself, there are just some things to look out for. So have a look at that section. Okay, so we've solved both problems. So in summary, we identified sort of the two main challenges that there were with the toolbar sort of up front, and then which were overflow and the pop-up alignment. We reviewed what features we had, what tools we had, and realized that, okay, so we need to reduce the numbers of dynamics to make a nice efficient interface. And then we achieved that by using the sort of layering of attached cell method. And then for the pop-up alignment, what we really found actually was just a general way to locate and size items when the mouse is over them, as long as they're wrapped in event handlers. And we did that with various combinations of different relative mouse positions. Yes, this is a really fun project to work on, and I just want to thank the team. So Kevin for a ton of implementation, Lou again on implementation, John, Brett, and Path for UX as well. Any questions? So if I just go back to that, where was it? Here we go. So it was here, right? Yeah. So the idea is that this is literally just the row of items and the line breaking off one by one, and then we're only viewing the top row. And so that's fine for getting the elision behavior, but the problem is we also want the overflow menu. And so how do you know which items have line broken away? And so how do you know which ones to put in the overflow menu? And so you could do that by like tracking the window width, for example. So you could kind of make like a combination of two approaches, but then you still have that dynamic that's constantly running. It's better, but it's still not great. And so that's why the layering just does everything for you. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And yes. And so the key thing there is the line breaking adjustments. You need to set it to make sure that it's line breaking away as words would off a line of text one by one. So they will, their parent, although their parent is hidden, their parent hasn't been destroyed. Actually, I mean, John will be able to give a better answer here, I feel. But I'm not sure. Okay. Cheers.